Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Tamara Myles and Wes Adams, thank you so much for joining me on Meaningful Work Matters today. It is such a pleasure to be able to have you. We got to know each other several years ago when both of you went through the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania. And at the time, both of you were incredibly passionate about the ways that leaders can bring meaningful work to life within their organizations. And in the years past, since you graduating, you've just kept digging, doing research, working with organizations, working with leaders around how folks are actually doing it. And so I'm really excited to hear the latest of what your thinking is around the relationship between meaningful work and leadership, and to hear about what that journey has been like for you. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
Maybe you can just start by introducing yourselves. Wes, why don't you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how your relationship is with meaningful work.
Sure. I'm Wes Adams. I'm the CEO of SV Consulting Group. I'm also the co-author of an upcoming book on meaningful work with Tamara, and I'm a meaningful work researcher at the Positive Psychology Center at University of Pennsylvania. And I originally came to this topic because I spent about 10 years working in social impact organizations and found that having a strong purpose, a strong mission orientation was inspiring, but it wasn't enough to make work sustainably meaningful in the long term. I found that a lot of mission-driven organizations weren't necessarily great places to work. And so I wanted to understand what are all of the factors that go into making work meaningful, and how can we hopefully help teach leaders how to bring those into our organizations, because I think that benefits everyone.
And I'm Tamara. I'm really excited to be here. I, like Wes, run a practice, a business, helping leaders create high-performing organizations where people thrive. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, and the original focus of my business was on productivity, increasing personal productivity and systems so people could be more productive. And after about 15 years of doing that, I started to really be curious about what's beyond productivity. You know, productivity for the sake of doing more was never the intent of my work. And I started noticing that when we have systems in place, it allows people to spend more time on what truly matters. And I wanted to understand how leaders can enable that focus more strongly. And so that's why I came to MAP and then met Wes, and our backgrounds complemented each other so well, coming, at meaningful work from different angles. And I like to think of myself as an accidental researcher, really. I never intended to do all this research, but it's really exciting and I love it.
Tamara's got the other half of my brain, which is
I really love the way that both of you kind of come together and to be able to describe this body of research of being a pracademic, of somebody who is actually trying to bring quality research to the table, but also truly working in organizations and trying to figure out what all of this means in real life in the context of the working world that doesn't necessarily always correlate with what we might study in the universities or in the labs. So it's great to be able to have you both here. Maybe let's just start with an easy one. Why should people care about finding meaning in their work?
Why not? Right? I mean, there's so many reasons. When we spend half of our waking lives working. And there's research from Gallup that finds that career well-being, so liking what we do every day, is the biggest contributor to our overall well-being. And so I deeply believe that the work we do every day should be meaningful. When we know how what we do matters and that we matter, this really increased sense of meaningful work contributes to not only us performing better at work, being more productive, having more motivation, but also we're happier at home and we have a more sense of meaning in life. And so there's just so many benefits. And if we're going to work anyways, I believe that work should really be meaningful. And not that meaning should only come from our jobs, but it's a huge part of our well-being.
Wes, you mentioned before that, meaningful work wasn't always enough to make for a great place to work. Can you kind of get into that a little bit more and maybe talk about what else is necessary?
Well, so what I said actually was that having a strong purpose or a mission-driven organization wasn't enough to make work meaningful. And so I think probably it's important for us to define the way that we think about meaningful work, which is work that allows you to belong to a community of values, that helps you understand how you contribute to something larger than yourself, and also allows you the opportunity to learn and grow. And so those three factors, community, contribution, and challenge, are the three sources of meaningful work that Tamara and I focus on. And all of those things have to be present. So in the organizations I was working in, there was a very high sense of contribution. You knew that you were making a difference in the world or doing something positively to impact the lives of others, but maybe there wasn't the opportunity to learn and grow, or maybe it was actually a little bit of a toxic organization. And even though people were working towards a common goal, they weren't getting along so well with each other. And that all of those things need to be present for work to be meaningful in our view and in our research.
Community, contribution, and challenge. Three great C's. That's great. Tamara, do you have anything else that you want to add around that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few myths around meaningful work that we found, over the course of our work with organizations. That one's a big one, and meaningful work and purpose are used so interchangeably. The other one is this idea of pleasure versus meaning or happiness, right? And so having moments of joy at work and positive emotions is really important, and obviously contributes to our well-being as well. But that we all know, right, as positive psychology practitioners, and knowing the literature, that meaning and pleasure, or meaning and happiness, are different. And so thinking about meaningful work more holistically as a combination of those three factors, and it's at that intersection where meaningful work lives. They don't always have to be at the same level. You can have more of one of the C's and less of the others. But if one of the C's is at zero, if you have high contribution and high sense of challenge, but zero sense of community, work is not meaningful, right? It's a multiplier effect. You can't multiply something by zero.
It makes me think a little bit of the ways in which, at least in the context of trying to increase positivity in an organization, there can sometimes be this label that is applied to organizations that try relentlessly to create a positive work environment, that it actually creates a toxically positive work environment. Can the same thing be true around meaning?
It's not a problem that I've encountered. And I know I love your paper with Carol Riff, and there's the literature on the dark side of meaningful work. And I don't think the problem is about too much meaning, but it's about too little fairness or too little dignity. And so I don't think, I've never seen in my practice the problem of too much meaning. There could be, but I have never seen that. I'm sorry, Wes, what were you going to add?
No, I mean, I generally agree with that. I think the And I also really appreciated your paper, and you cited the zookeepers and the taking advantage essentially of people who have a high level of passion or commitment to their work. And I think that that also happened, like that level of extractive employment rather than collaborative or co-creating employment happens in a lot of different industries, right? And I agree with Tamara that it's more a problem of taking that approach than it is providing people too much meaning. I mean, in general, I think there's like far too little meaning in work, and we don't talk about this or focus on this enough. I'm less concerned about giving people too much meaning, although I think we do have to be careful about taking advantage of people, which I see as a different, the fairness versus meaningful work. Yeah.
Well said. There's, most of this conversation that we're going to be having today is going to revolve around the role of leadership in creating the conditions for meaningful work. That is a huge element of what your research and practice has been. So maybe before we get into what you've actually learned about how you lead for contexts of meaning and fairness, which is probably there as well, why was this something that both of you chose to study? Why leadership?
For me, I think it's the highest leverage opportunity that we have to positively impact the largest number of people. So I chose to work in business and organizations because I think that's one of the last places that we all come together and actually interact with people who are different than us, who have different views than us, and work side by side with those people. And so I think it's a huge lever of opportunity actually for us to promote thriving and also to promote larger positive societal change. And leaders are the ones who are best positioned to affect that change at scale within organizations. So really, it was for me, a matter of trying to have the biggest positive impact that I could.
Similarly, for me, leaders are the architects of the environments where people work, and so they are not solely responsible, but they do design those environments. And so I had been working with leaders on creating systems for a long time, and I knew that they had so much influence on that. And then separately, they say that in psychology, a lot of research is me search. I had experiences in my personal professional life of leaders that were either like creating really meaningful work environments in industries. I worked in advertising before I started my own business. And, advertising is not really thought of as like a hugely meaningful kind of work environment. And I had experienced an ad agency with a leader who made work so meaningful, showed us our contribution, let us take risks and challenged us to grow. There was a development plan, built a lot of community. And then my last work experience was with a leader who did the opposite and destroyed meaning. And I was just so curious to understand and dig into that influence.
This is probably a good segue into how you went about trying to go from that research to research. And so I'm curious what you've learned about the process of doing research. I know that when you started this work and you're doing your thesis projects as part of the master's program of applied positive psychology at Penn, you were really focused on exemplar research. So just as you were talking about taking a great example of people who are doing it right and potentially deconstructing kind of what are they doing it right? What are they doing right? And how does that work? And I know you've gone from that into a whole bunch of qualitative studies as well. Can you just paint us a little picture of the kind of research that you have been doing over the last few years and also what you've learned as practitioners about what it's actually like to do research?
I'll let Wes take us through the process, but I'll just distill the learnings into like two main nuggets. Number one, it's really important to have great partners in the research. And number two, it takes a long time to get a paper published. Those are my two big learnings. And then Wes can take us through the process.
I will echo those 100%. I think we were very fortunate to partner with Zach Mercurio at Colorado State University, who's the lead researcher on a lot of what we've done over the last few years, and Jer Clifton, who, of course, you know from University of Pennsylvania. And having great partners, complementing, just like any other project, it's great to have people with different expertises and viewpoints and all of that sort of thing. I think the process of actually going through the scientific method of even just the qualitative research, right? We did grounded theory methodology, which you may be familiar with if you follow Brene Brown or anything like that, but essentially interviewing lots of different people and looking for the common threads that tie them together. And that takes a huge amount of time to do that, to transcribe it, to go through it and code it and all of that stuff. And I think the quality of the output is worth it. And it's just so much more time than I think either one of us anticipated. And then, moving into we took our initial qualitative research and the things that we found from high performing leaders at places like Google and HubSpot and Marriott and Schneider Electric and all of these different companies of different sizes and industries, and then distilled those into a set of leadership behaviors that we believed would impact an individual's sense of meaning at work, would make work more meaningful for the people in that organization. And then we went through the process of empirically validating those things through quantitative research. And that's a very intensive process as well, designing surveys and having to understand how to set things up so you can determine the correlations and causations between different behaviors and their outcomes. And that's when it's really important to have great partners like Jer, especially, who did a lot of the statistical analysis and and totally worth it, because one of the things that we were able to learn from this process of doing multiple of those studies over several years was about half of an individual's experience of meaning at work can be tied to these leadership behaviors that we've identified. So leaders have a huge impact on how meaningful we find our work, which to us is such an enormous opportunity to bring more meaning and through it more organizational and individual well-being into the world. So I think that's really exciting.
How do you go about actually measuring whether somebody thinks that their work is meaningful?
So what we did, after we did the qualitative study, which, by the way, I don't know if everybody listening knows, but Andrew was our fearless and inspiring leader and mentor through that process as our advisor. But after we had the 10, we created a scale, and I think it had like 100 items, right? And through the process and the factor analysis and all that went into that, we ended up with a scale of 26 items. And that scale measures the leadership behaviors, if like, are leaders doing this or not? And then we also used other scales that were already existing and validated scales of psychological meaningfulness, the meaning work inventory, to see, okay, my leader does or doesn't do these things. And then separately, do I experience meaning at work or not? And then we correlated those. And so that's how we went about finding the whether those practices actually make work meaningful or not.
So let's actually dig into some of those practices. I think that is it 6 that you've boiled them down to at this point?
Wes, why don't you start?
Sure. One of them is focusing on impact, right? Which we've talked about a little bit already. So letting people, helping people to understand how their day-to-day work connects to the larger goals, the larger purpose of the organization, talking about the mission and values in the day-to-day work. Having those conversations actively is a big part of that. And then making sure people are able to make those connections for themselves. So that can look like bringing in a beneficiary of the work, right? Making sure that people who work in the accounting department actually get to meet some customers and see the positive impact, the ways that, the business product is helping people. I use Calendly often as an example, right? It's a scheduling software that, many of us are familiar with. And that doesn't necessarily seem like a super meaningful company, right? But if you think about the fact that, people are saving an hour a week using that software instead of the back and forth on emails, and that's an hour a week you get to spend on deep work or go home and spend with your family instead, that becomes much more meaningful. And hearing that from a customer helps people, who are kind of in the background of the company, not necessarily working on the front lines, understand that the work really has impact.
We are not sponsored by Calendly, but I'm a big Calendly user, and it's way more than a week, a month, an hour a week that it saves me. It's those tools are incredible. Yeah, great.
And what are you doing with that time? Right,
making a podcast apparently.
That's great. And so that one, communicating the impact was the highest, had the highest correlation with meaningful work, and not surprising. That's what most people think about, like the sense of purpose. The second highest correlated one was recognizing and nurturing potential in people. And that one is all about seeing people's strengths, recognizing those strengths and then giving them opportunities to learn, grow, and develop. One of the stories that we heard in our study came from Schneider Electric, and the woman who we interviewed, Sonali Sapathi, said that when she started there, she was kind of new on the job, and the CEO tapped her directly to create a training program for high potential employees. And it wasn't something that she had done before, but she came with some experience in that department, but she was new, and she just felt like she was given so much trust and responsibility. And her direct supervisor and manager really supported her. And she just felt like she wanted to prove everybody right. She had resources, she had support, she had people believing in her potential. And when we interviewed her, it had been 6 years, and that still stood out as one of the most meaningful career experiences that she had. And so that practice is all about treating every employee as a high potential individual, right? When we look at organizations, they have 5%, maybe 10% of their talent pool as high potential individuals. What does that tell the other 90%, right? What if everyone was a high potential? What if everyone has strengths? What if we try to unlock those strengths and give them opportunities to use those?
Mm. That's beautiful. I have spent a lot of my my career working in HR and specifically talent management. And within talent management, we are all very familiar with things like 9-box models, where you map potential against performance and put people into very specific boxes. And the question always is, would you actually ever want to share that information of which box people are in with the people who you are actually rating in your room? And the answer is almost always no, because unless you're high potential, it's kind of a horrible experience. No one wants to be put out to a box.
And we know, like from research in the Pygmalion effect, that what we think of people, what we believe of them becomes true based on how we interact with them. And so it's such a missed opportunity. And of course, we have higher performers in organizations, but there's such an opportunity there to unlock the performance of everyone.
What's number 3? We've got impact, nurturing potential. What's next?
I'm going to jump in on one of the ones that you focus on, Tamara, because I think it follows nicely, which is actually around how you recruit and onboard people around values, right? I mean, we were just talking about high potential and focusing on people's skills, right? And one of the things that we've learned and research supports is that having people in the organization who align with your values, who are the right character fit, for your particular organization is just as, if not more important than having someone who's a high performer, right? There's Harvard research on toxic high performing workers and how it's much better to avoid one of those than to have a high performer at all in the organization. And some of the behaviors that we identified in this bucket were talking about values, screening for values in the interview process. So a lot of organizations like Zappos and BetterUp and some others have values-based interviews as part of the process. And that's even if you're like a really promising candidate and you are very highly skilled and all of that, if you're not if you don't pass the values interview, if you don't meet that bar, then you don't get hired, right? And it's important I think, as a sidebar, to say this is not about hiring people who all believe exactly the same thing. It's about people who have a diversity of perspectives on, what transparency means and what that looks like in an organization, or, how we're going to put customers first in this organization or whatever. And then when you bring them on to the organization, when you onboard them, it's not just about giving them a computer and setting them up with an email account and having them do their tax paperwork, right? How are you culturally onboarding them? How are you, allowing them to build authentic relationships with other people in the organization? And I think Tamara can probably jump in on some specifics there.
Yeah, this was actually one of the most exciting findings in our research, because we hadn't seen a lot of meaningful work literature around this idea that beginnings really matter and how you begin that relationship, excuse me, from the hiring process, right? Because onboarding kind of really begins at hiring, but when they're actually brought into the organization really matters for how meaningful their work becomes and the behaviors that they will then exhibit as an employee. And so we were excited about that. And some of the onboarding practices that we found really centered on the two main things that Wes said. So cultural mastery and authentic relationship building. So cultural mastery was we found companies have these quirky rituals that are really unique to their culture. But by telling the stories of each values and by bringing employees into the fold of the rituals, they kind of become like in the in-group right away. They feel the sense of belonging. And then by building authentic connections, that one's all about allowing the employees and encouraging the new employees to show up authentically and show up as their whole selves from the beginning, because it's so important later on that people can show up authentically for work to be meaningful and develop those relationships that are based on who they really are. And so some things that they do for that are some questions that they ask that are really particular to, who are you when you're doing your best work? How do you like to receive feedback? How do you like to give feedback? And like questions like that get to know their personalities right away. So that was really exciting for our research. And we love the specificity of a process-based behavior that we found.
I really appreciate the ways in which big picture organizational values are complemented with that perspective around helping somebody identify their own personal values and authentic paths to those bigger picture values in the organization, and not just hiring for culture fit, but hiring for culture complementarity.
Just going back to that real quick, Adam Grant's new book, Hidden Potential, right, is all about this idea of character skills. One of the pushbacks that we often get, is exactly what Wes addressed. Like, how do you deal with like culture fit, but still create diversity? And in his book, I loved how he positioned that as, when you're actually hiring for character, you're increasing the diversity pool because you are opening up the possibility that someone who may not have as developed skills because they haven't had the opportunities to go to the top schools or to work at the top organizations with the best leaders, but maybe they've had a tougher time, but look, they've really developed their perseverance and their resilience, and they're bringing all this in. So thinking about it like that it actually allows you to hire more diverse people if you focus on who they are versus what they know.
One of the leadership behaviors that really stood out is integrity, walking your talk, right? And this was actually one that it was kind of the lowest correlation with increasing meaning, but the highest with destroying it, right? It's almost table stakes. If you're saying one thing and doing another, that's probably the quickest way for a leader to destroy trust, to destroy meaning in the organization, because you're not believable anymore. Right. And so understanding how, if we go back to how are they more than just words on the wall? What do values look like in action? And having a clear, and I think especially in the world we're in now, in a hybrid world where we don't see people face to face as much as we used to, leaders have to intentionally role model those values. They have to go out of their way to explain why they made a decision, right? One of the folks that we interviewed is the CEO of a company, and he says every time they make a big decision that affects the employees of the company, he records a video and he explains it. And he says, here's what we did. Here's why we decided to, change our, the structure of the organization. And it's because it serves this value and it serves this value. And here's some of the trade-offs that we made. And then they have a question and answer session about it. And, there's a lot of investment in communicating those values-based behaviors and being very transparent about them throughout the operation of the business.
Certainly in the work that I've done throughout my career, the difference between what people say and what people do has such an immense impact, especially on, I think you're right, outrage. It's not necessarily the thing that that people will point to when it's working really well, but as soon as it fails to work well, as soon as there's that gap between, in the academic literature, it's described as espoused versus enacted values. And yeah. So this difference between espoused and enacted values has a real huge impact on making people feel really morally outraged when they feel it.
And we're very quick to cancel people these days. So,
Absolutely.
which is actually something that showed up in our research as well, like this idea of allowing people the space to grow. I think having that growth mindset, giving them a little room to fly and to fail, I guess, which kind of leads us into one of the other practice areas, which is autonomy. And, I'm sure folks are familiar with self-determination theory and the idea of autonomy. What showed up specifically in our research was this idea of what we call aligned autonomy, or autonomy that is bounded by the values of the organization, right? So we're not just giving you free rein, do whatever you want to do to get to this outcome, but with the understanding that these are kind of the guides and the guardrails. Our values are what drive the how of our organization, giving people the freedom within that to not only figure out how they're going to do their work, but also where they're going to do their work, and even come up with innovative ideas for what they're going to work on to guide their own career development or the strategic direction of the company.
That bounded autonomy is, I think, a really helpful context to be able to share. Many organizations that I've worked with over the years have tried in various ways to create the context for autonomy, empowerment, different language in different ways. And I think that there's a lot of fear, especially when you don't have high trust either direction, either going down or going up in the organization, around what's going to happen if we actually give people that autonomy or allow people to be empowered. And of course, the answer is create a sandbox. Where is the opportunity to be to have that kind of self-determination, to have that choice and the freedom to choose your own adventure, and where isn't there? Where do we need to make sure that we are all swimming in the same direction?
Well,
We
going to
have
bring us
one more.
home with the
Yeah,
last one.
last
Last
one.
but not least, it's all about fostering personal connections. So helping employees build authentic relationships across departments in the organizations. So, all the organizations in our study were really intentional about not only building relationships within their teams, but also across departments. And they did that from the onboarding. Most of them onboard different cohorts together and then have mechanisms in place so they'll stay in touch. So Google, for example, has their Noogler class put meetings on their schedule in 3 months and 6 months, so they'll connect and stay in touch. Microsoft pioneered this whole idea of onboarding buddies, right? And so right away they partner a new employee with somebody who's a little more experienced, and that buddy kind of becomes your office friend, somebody who you can reach out and ask questions about the culture or how to navigate a situation, or even like, where can I find a certain document, things like that. And then beyond the onboarding, the fostering of relationships really happens through shared experiences. So designing shared experiences that go beyond just like a happy hour, even though happy hours also count. But we like to think about it in two dimensions, the shared experiences. One is having a purpose for the experience, like what's the point of what we're doing? And the other one is a sense of challenge. Like the harder something is that we're doing together, the more connected we feel. And so something with like a high sense of purpose and a high sense of challenge might be building a Habitat for Humanity home together, right? That really helps us feel connected and like we're part of something. And something lower on the purpose and challenge might be a happy hour or, a fika, like let's all have coffee together, coffee breaks together so we can get to know each other. But having a portfolio of experiences of different kinds where people can engage really helps build relationships.
I'm curious what you've learned in terms of the relationship between these behaviors and various outcomes. Let's just start there.
Yeah, I think all of these behaviors increase individual sense of meaning. So when leaders enact these behaviors, people find their work more meaningful. And we also measured things like job satisfaction. We used a mattering scale as well. And we looked at some other measures of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And, unsurprisingly, all of those things move in a positive direction when leaders are enacting these behaviors. And also intention to leave an organization goes way down. So these have huge impacts both on individual well-being and also organizational well-being.
Was there anything really surprising you didn't expect when you started to look at the data?
I think we were measuring extrinsic motivation too, and there was a small but positive relationship between some of these practices and extrinsic motivation, which we did not expect. We haven't really unpacked that a lot, but I think it's the only thing I can remember that was completely unexpected. What about you,
Tell us a little
Wes?
bit about just tell us what extrinsic motivation means in this context.
Oh, that means being motivated by external rewards rather than an internal drive. And so when we're thinking about meaningful work and having this burning sense of purpose and connection and being driven to learn and grow, we think about these as like we're internally motivated. It's our psychological fuel to boost our motivation versus a carrots and sticks kind of reward. Maybe a bonus if we do this or promotion. Those are more extrinsic motivations.
But there was a positive relationship in some way between the meaningful work and the extrinsic.
Yeah.
And so without having explored that in any way whatsoever, one of my hypotheses on that is that if you have good bosses who are doing these things, you probably are more motivated to impress them and get their approval or, be recognized by those people in a certain way. So that would be a totally unsupported guess on my part for why we might have seen that.
It also speaks a little bit to some of the other research that's been done in this territory around the relationship between meaning and decency, or meaning and fairness, as you talked about before, and how important it is for people who are doing meaningful work to feel like they're being treated fairly in the process. Maybe there's a connection there. Very cool. I love all of this. I'm curious. I mean, both of you are students of leadership in various different ways, and there's lots of leadership models out there. Do you think that these 6 things are different than other things like transformational leadership or authentic leadership, or different ways of thinking about positive leadership in different ways?
The good news is that we actually looked at that in the paper, because it was one of the early feedback rounds. That's one of the questions we got asked by a peer review editor. And so then we measured our scale against 3 other ones: transformational leadership, empowering leadership, and ethical leadership. And so while there was a lot of similarity, there were several unique dimensions that were not fully captured by the other leadership scales. And so it was different enough and still related, which is good. I mean, we weren't trying really to develop a new leadership style, right? It's not like we played around with, like, do we call it meaningful leadership or something? And it's not really what we set out to do. It was more like a playbook of best practices, if you're trying to increase meaningful work. And really, well-being is being talked about so much right now, well-being at work, and it's become a priority. And this is a way to think of well-being as a strategy instead of an adjacent benefit, right? When work is meaningful, when you focus on those 3 C's, people's well-being increases. That's a way to kind of infuse well-being in the culture as a strategy. And so that's more of what we were setting out to do than create a leadership style. And they are very related, but different enough.
I would add to that behavior is more important than belief in this instance, right? Like, we don't ask you to subscribe to the idea that meaning is the most important thing, even though we think that it is, and you should. What we're focused on is the fact that these behaviors work, right? These behaviors actually lead to the outcomes that all of us want for ourselves at work, for our organizations, as leaders, to find more meaning in our own work, right? So I think we're much more focused on doing the things that work rather than trying to convince people that they need to believe, in a certain leadership style or have a particular mindset when it comes to these things. So it's more of a practical
You put it
approach.
so well, Wes. That's exactly what I was trying to say.
My last research-oriented question for anybody who's listening who might be interested in doing more research in the field of meaningful work. Maybe you're a master, maybe you're somebody who's doing some sort of positive organizational scholarship or research. What are the biggest gaps and holes that you'd love to see filled around the literature that you reviewed?
We need more experiments on this. There's a fair amount of longitudinal research, but we need to see interventions. We need to see more people focusing on this. I mean, even just I'm writing the chapter in the book right now that's on positive feedback, right? And it's incredible how little research, experimental research, there is on giving positive feedback at work. We know that it's very impactful, but there are few experimental studies that look at when you tell people what's going well, right? When you are reinforcing what's going right, what actual impact does that have on business outcomes? We're actually doing in the next couple of months a study on that specifically. And I think all of these practices have specific behaviors associated with them that we want to try to do experimentally and continue to study. So if anyone out there wants to pick up the gauntlet on that, please contact us, and we would be more than happy to support.
Shout out to Lisa Sansom, our mutual colleague, and Eudaimonic by Design advisor, who is doing a ton of work right now on for her doctorate, positive feedback.
One more area that I think would be important to look at with these practices is different populations, whether you want to look at gender differences, race differences, generational differences. In our study, we didn't find any significant differences across demographics, but we weren't looking specifically at that. And I don't think our sample had enough diversity for us to really know for sure. And I think that we get asked that, and that would be a really great area to focus on.
I think in the conversation around generational differences and Gen Z and some of the divides or the perceived divides that exist there, because I think our view on that is that this is a unifying set of behaviors that can bridge those divides.
Yeah, I would imagine cross-culturally too, that there's, when you look at those 6 dimensions, impact, potential, recruiting for values and onboarding around integrity, autonomy, fostering personal connections, those things, those behaviors can be done in very different ways in different cultures and have potentially different impacts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the scale is available for researchers to test it, in different domains. And we would love to see it really kind of take hold and more researchers test it.
Where you've talked about a book. When is this mysterious book going to get published? And what can people do until that book is published if they want to find out more?
So we are currently finalizing the manuscript, which is due in a couple short months to the publisher. And the tentative date is early 2025. It'll be published by Public Affairs, which is a division of Hachette. So we're super excited to have it out there. And we have so many great stories and examples from the leaders we interviewed, but also the leaders we work with that are implementing these practices. And so we're super excited to get it out there. But in the meantime, while you wait, you can connect with us both on LinkedIn. We share anecdotes and stories and podcast interviews. And we also have a shared website for our work together, which is makeworkmeaningful.co. So you can find out some case studies and information there as well.
Well, thank you both so much for your insights, for helping us make meaningful work matter, and for just your dedication to this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for having us, Andrew.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.